Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Tony and Jennifer, for being with us. We here at the Garfield County Libraries are happy that we can help host different programs. Today, we have a very informative session with Alpine Legal Services and Jennifer Smith of Smith Immigration. Before we get started, I do want to go over some of our Zoom functions. This is being recorded and it is also being streamed live on the library's Facebook. Jennifer will take care of the presentation for us today and Tony will facilitate it. If you have any comments or questions, please use the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. And if you have any questions for Jennifer, try to use the Q&A function. That will save the questions for a more appropriate time for them to be answered. The last thing is this is being presented in English and Spanish simultaneously. If you look at the bottom menu on your Zoom screen, you'll see a gridded globe icon. Please click on that and choose the language of your preference. Ahora en español, esto está presentado en inglés.
Now for in Spanish, this is being presented in English and Spanish.
Si quieren escuchar
if you wish to hear this in Spanish, go to the link in the bottom.
La opción del globo.
There is a globe.
Y escojan
and press that and choose the language of your choice.
Okay. With that, Tony, I will go ahead and let you get started. I will help get people into our webinar.
Great, thank you, Alex. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Mendez. I'm an attorney with Alpine Legal Services. We work from Aspen to Parachute on a variety of civil matters. Today, we're doing a Know Your Rights presentation with immigration attorney Jennifer Smith. This presentation is being put on by Alpine Legal Services, Smith Immigration, and Garfield County Libraries. Jennifer Smith today will be presenting on deferred action for childhood arrivals, temporary protected status, and asylum. Please type any questions you may have in the question and answer box, and we will try to get to it at the end of the presentation. Without further ado, we're going to give the reins over to Jennifer Smith. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Smith. I'm an attorney, an immigration attorney here in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and we have clients all over the United States and all over the world. And while we've limited today's conversation to just 3 topics, there is a lot to talk about in those. And my goal here is to provide information that's helpful, but not necessarily to provide legal advice. So with that, I'm going to share my screen so that hopefully you can see the slides. I'm going to make sure I have the right one. And then you should be able to see the slides. Oh, my apologies, one moment. There we go. So you should be able to see those. So we're going to start with DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and we're going to give some updates on those. Because of litigation and other issues, we can only file to renew DACA status at this time. We can file initial DACA applications, that is applications for someone who's never had DACA before, or for someone who has let their DACA expire for more than a year. However, USCIS will not adjudicate or make a decision on those applications. It simply puts them on hold. For people that do have DACA and are ready to renew, the timing for renewal is inconsistent. We are highly recommending that you renew your DACA before it expires. If your DACA has been expired for less than 1 year, you can do a regular renewal process. However, if your DACA status has been expired for 1 year or more, as I said before, you have to file it as if it's an initial DACA application with all the initial evidence. And again, that application will simply be placed on hold. It will not be adjudicated. So right now we're seeing adjudications of renewals taking about 3 to 3.5 months, with some cases being faster and some cases being slower. With that said, we are recommending that our clients file their renewal applications anywhere from 4 to 6 months in advance of the expiration date on their current work permit. The reason we recommend doing that is because we don't want you to have any gaps in between your work permits. Those times where you don't have a valid work permit mean that you will accrue something called unlawful presence. And accumulating unlawful presence in certain quantities, such as over a year, can limit some of your other options down the road for possibly seeking a more permanent status. The other issue with gaps between your work permits is that, technically speaking, you are not allowed to work once your DACA work permit expires, and you cannot start work until the new one arrives with the start date. That can cause some issues, obviously, with employment. So again, that just brings me back to recommending you file early. For those of you that are interested in the details of the litigation, the case is the state of Texas et al. Versus the United States of America. That is the current litigation that's mandating that immigration continue to accept initial and renewal DACA applications. However, because of an order from July 16th, 2021, USCIS is prohibited. USCIS, I'm going to back up for just a second. I just used an acronym. USCIS is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. It's a synonym for immigration. So there are a lot of acronyms in immigration, so I'll try to remember to explain them when I come across them. But it's important for you to know that right now we are stuck with being unable to file initial DACA applications. The good news is, for those of you that are renewing your DACA, is that our work permits are valid for 2 years. So that means we don't have to renew quite as often as we did in the past. Another important point I want to mention about DACA at this time is that advance parole or permission to travel is allowed. That means that if you have DACA, you can request something called advance parole that will give you permission to travel outside of the US and come back to the US. As noted here on the slide, there's a specific form, some requirements, and a filing fee. Under DACA, you have to have very specific reasons for wanting to travel outside of the United States. The 3 categories are humanitarian purposes, employment purposes, and educational purposes. So we have had clients who've needed to travel for work, to attend a conference or other issue. We've had clients who need to attend to travel a class. With a lot of things being handled through Zoom, some of that is less common. So right now, the most common reason we see for international travel is for humanitarian purposes. And that's usually to return to your home country to see a relative or someone who is sick or is having issues or needs help in some way. I do not recommend that you pursue advanced parole or travel outside of the US if you have any criminal history or prior deportation without talking to an immigration attorney first. These applications for advanced parole are taking about 6 months to adjudicate. There is a process by which you can request an emergency travel permit. However, you should know that these applications take about 6 months. So if you think you need to travel outside of the US, you're going to want to plan in advance and get that application in early. Some examples additional examples, I think, of humanitarian reasons to travel outside of the US can include to obtain medical treatment, to attend funeral services, to visit a sick or ailing relative. And those are the most common ones that we're seeing right now. And at least for now, we're seeing them all be approved, which is great. There can be some real advantages to travel outside of the US while you have DACA, because when you return to the US, at least currently, it gives you a lawful entry to the US. So for some people who may have come to the United States when they were young children without permission, traveling outside the US and returning now gives you a lawful entry, which may open up some additional options for pursuing a green card. So that can be a really helpful strategy piece. So make sure you're looking into that if you have questions about that, or think you may have some opportunities there. I am going to skip to our next topic, and that is temporary protected status. For temporary protected status, I have a list here on the slide of the current countries that are allowed to apply for temporary protected status. Temporary protected status is, even though it says status in the name, it's really not a status. It is protection against deportation and ability to work in the United States temporarily. The US government may designate a foreign country for TPS due to conditions in the country that temporarily prevent the country's nationals from returning safely. A very recent example of this would be Ukraine. It's so recent, it's not even on my slide, but you should note that Ukraine is included in this list at this time. And because of that, our US country, our government has said, these particular people can't go back, but we don't want them to be stuck here without the ability to work or be safe. So we've created this special category. And we designate what's required to apply for this temporary protected status country by country, which means the rules and requirements for each country are different. I have listed on the slide a link to the part of the immigration website that has more information about what those individual options are for each country. Some of these countries, in particular, El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Sudan, do not have a current process to renew a work permit. And that's because there is litigation. And in this litigation, the US government cannot end the temporary protected status for people from these countries that have already had it. And because the government can't end TPS for them, people from those countries who have valid prior old expired work permits for TPS have them automatically renewed. They don't have to apply for a new work permit as long as the government keeps automatically renewing them. Another factor about TPS is that you can apply for advanced parole again. That's that travel permit we talked about. And I'm going to get to a little bit more of that in a second. You can see on the USCIS or immigration website at the link on the slide, the different federal court cases that are designated the different extensions of times for these countries that are listed: Haiti, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Sudan. In addition, at that same place, you would be able to obtain information about how to go about applying for TPS if you are from Ukraine. If anyone needs, the other issue we get a lot in my practice is that people with TPS from those particular countries get questions at work about wanting the employer wants the worker to provide a new work permit because the old one is expired. So oftentimes we have to draft a letter with a copy of what's called the Federal Register or the federal regulation that automatically extends our clients' work permits. That's pretty easy process. You can print that out and take it to your employer as well. An employer is not allowed to ask for specific documents as proof of your employment. However, many of them don't understand the automatic extension for work permits in TPS, and so it can be helpful to just educate them with that information. Okay. So on this slide, I have information about travel and adjustment with TPS. With TPS, you are allowed to apply for advanced parole, which will allow you to travel outside of the US and come back into the US. Unlike DACA, to get a travel permit, you do not need any special reasons for your travel. You do not need to justify why you need to travel. The second part of this slide talks about adjustment, and I want to explain what that is. Adjustment of status is the process by which certain people can apply for a green card inside of the United States. So a typical example would be the spouse of a US citizen who maybe entered with a tourist visa, fell in love, got married, and now they're applying to adjust to the status of a lawful permanent resident inside of the US without leaving. For many years, there were lots of practitioners, attorneys, and even some court cases that said that a simple grant of TPS allows someone to then adjust to a green card without needing someone else to petition for them. However, that concept has been shut down. That does not exist any longer. The sub-question then remains, if someone has TPS and travels outside the US and comes back in and has a lawful entry, can they adjust to a green card based on a petition by a family member or an employer, for example? So let's say you came to the US many, many, many decades ago, but you entered without permission. And after you entered the US, you obtained TPS. And you traveled outside the US with advanced parole to see your family, and you came back in again. Up until very recently, lawyers were allowed to then file for green card applications for those clients if there was someone else who could petition for them, such as a US citizen child who had turned 21. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case under USCIS interpretation. In August of 2020, USCIS issued an administrative decision called Matter of ZRZC that said that entry off of a travel permit does not qualify as the correct type of entry for adjustment of status. This decision, of course, will be under litigation for some time. However, if you traveled and returned to the US under advanced parole, but prior to August 20th, 2020, this option is still open for you. I know this is a little complicated. I do recommend you talk to a licensed attorney about it to make sure you're getting good advice. But those are some recent updates that have been happening in TPS. Okay. I'm going to move on here to asylum. For asylum, I've started with a slide about affirmative asylum. So there are two ways to file for asylum. One is called affirmative asylum. That's when you file asylum because you're in the United States and you can't go back to your home country, but you are not in immigration court proceedings. You are not fighting a deportation. The second way to file for asylum is called defensive asylum. You file that application if you're in court proceedings and are seeking asylum in order to prevent your deportation. Oftentimes, we have clients that start in one situation and end up in the other situation. So I've decided to focus on affirmative asylum updates. We can also talk about defensive asylum issues if people have questions about that, for those of you that could be in immigration court proceedings. The most exciting update we have at this time about asylum is that the asylum officers have begun to travel again across the United States to provide asylum interviews to applicants. So since COVID, essentially, the asylum officers have not been traveling. So there haven't really been any asylum interviews happening except in exceptional circumstances or where the person could travel to the physical asylum office. In Colorado, our affirmative asylum office is located in Houston. So we are starting to see that affirmative asylum cases are getting scheduled for interviews. However, asylum cases are processed on a last in, first out basis. So that means that people who have filed within the last 21 days are a higher priority than people who've been pending since, say, 2016. Also, people who previously had an asylum interview scheduled but canceled due to COVID are higher priority. But essentially, the government's working with the newest filings and working backwards. That means that, like at our office, we have many clients who filed in 2016 who are at the back of the line. It will be quite some time before they receive an interview notice unless we have a reason to expedite. A lot of the information we hear about asylum focuses on the border in the news. And so I wanted to add a little information about that. US law says that a person has to physically step on US soil to seek asylum, that the minute they step on US soil, they can say, I request asylum so that I'm not sent home to my country while I be persecuted or tortured. However, we're having quite a bit of policy statements and other issues come up because right now, our government's not allowing anyone to access the US in order to request asylum. One of the few exceptions we've seen are unaccompanied children. This is something you hear about in the news all the time. Part of the problem is trying to figure out how to process people in a safe and reliable manner and making sure that the people processing asylum applications at the border can do so in a manageable way. Many years ago well, let me back that up. Issues with asylum have been happening under multiple different administrations over the last decade. So this isn't a partisan issue. Asylum is a difficult topic that various governmental leaders over the years have struggled with how to manage and whether it is even manageable. And it comes down to questions of how do we want to treat people that are fleeing dangerous situations? And people have very different opinions about that. But for now, the law has not changed. It's just been policy that has changed. The law, both in the US and internationally, still indicate that we are supposed to provide shelter and opportunity for asylum to people who present themselves requesting that protection. Another issue with asylum that I don't have on the slide that came up pretty recently is in another litigation issue. Asylum applicants who were renewing their work permits had to pay an additional $85 biometrics fee. That has been eliminated. USCIS finally updated their website on March 3rd to show that that biometric fee is no longer required if you are renewing your work permit under asylum. And that's true for both affirmative and defensive asylum applications. For those of you that may know people or you yourself may have an asylum application, you must have your asylum application pending for 180 days before you can become eligible for a work permit. That is one of the reasons why the government is currently processing cases on a last in, first out basis, is to limit the people that are eligible for work permits. We're seeing work permit renewal applications in asylum take quite some time. We've had some cases pending over a year or more just to renew a work permit. A lot of that has to do with COVID backlogs as well as these litigation issues. But what we're seeing largely in all of our cases is a lot of inconsistency and delay. We could have one client who's been waiting a year and a half and another client get their work permit in 30 days in the same category, filed around the same time. So it makes it very hard sometimes for us attorneys to have reliable information because the government itself is struggling with worker shortages and COVID and other things that are causing them to be inconsistent as well. So I don't have a separate slide for defensive asylum, but defensive asylum, again, is when you are in immigration court and you are going to be arguing your asylum case in front of an immigration judge. There is generally an urgency in immigration court to get asylum cases heard as quickly as possible. Currently, the government attorneys are trying to reduce the backlog in immigration court so that these asylum cases can move forward for people who want to move forward on them. As part of their efforts to reduce the backlog, government attorneys are reaching out in cases where people have an attorney and offering to dismiss or close certain immigration cases. We've been doing this quite a bit for a lot of our clients. Many of our clients who are unaccompanied children and have their asylum applications pending have received termination of their court proceedings. So that is it's a good thing because they can still pursue their asylum application, but no longer have to be in immigration court. So we are finding that system to be very helpful. That same system of discretion of the government being able to decide which cases are priorities for removal and which ones aren't has been very beneficial as far as moving cases forward that are a high priority and approving cases that don't even need a trial. So while we think that we should win all of our cases in immigration court, the government doesn't always agree to do that without a trial, but we've had a few of those happen recently, and that has been a relief for everyone, and it saves quite a bit of time and money for everyone as well. I think the other thing I want to make sure to discuss is just expectations that, as I mentioned, the government is very inconsistent in how it is processing cases and what kind of documents it is asking for. And so if you are working on an application either with an attorney or without, just know that every person's case is very different. No two immigration cases are the same. I have been doing this for 22 years, and I can tell you I have never seen two immigration cases that are the same. So patience is important, and making sure you have reliable information about what is happening in your case and good communication with either the government or your attorney to make sure you understand what's happening, because a lot of the times there are things that are outside of our control. The government is just being difficult or has, as you may have read in the news recently, they had the US government immigration service had thousands of files locked in a cave in Kansas City, and they couldn't get access to them. So that has impacted several of our clients who are unable to get the documents they need in order to get their green cards approved. So there are always weird little things like that happening all the time in immigration law. And Hopefully, this will give you some reassurance that things are moving forward, that there are things happening both with DACA, TPS, and asylum. But you should know that the policy has been changing quite a bit, and the timing of things has been changing quite a bit without much warning or without any kind of explanation from the government. So I might have gone too fast around my slides. I hope everyone was able to follow. But the last thing I wanted to remind everyone about is who can help you with your immigration application. It's really important that people understand that immigration is not just filling out forms. Every question on those forms is loaded with legal and historical information that could impact your case if you answer the question wrongly. Or it could even just delay your case if there's something wrong with it. That alone can be enough of a problem. But I want to make sure everyone knows that notarios, paralegals, legal assistants, case managers, licenciadas, notarias, therapists, nurses, tax preparers, etc., are not licensed immigration attorneys. And in the state of Colorado, it is illegal for someone who is not a lawyer to practice immigration law. And our state of Colorado has said that preparing immigration forms is the practice of law. There is a reason why lawyers cost more than non-lawyers for immigration cases. And that's because we have to use our experience and our access to information and the law every minute of every day to make sure we're doing the right thing for our clients. As you can see on the slide, it notes that it has the law that talks about when it is illegal for people who are non-lawyers to practice law. But I do want to also, I have a link in there about how to stop fraud in Colorado. We have in Colorado, the practice of law is governed by the Colorado Supreme Court. So the Colorado Supreme Court governs attorneys like me, and also is the one that goes out and tries to stop non-attorneys from practicing law as well. So their website at the coloradosupremecourt.com has a lot of information, and you can obtain information there in Spanish, and they have people on their phone number that speak Spanish if you need to report anything that's not correct. I want to make sure and note the second point on this slide, which is lawyers make mistakes too. And if you have a lawyer that you think is not following the rules or is not communicating with you or isn't doing what you think they should be doing, you can get a new lawyer and you can file a complaint. There's a way to do that so that those lawyers learn from their mistakes so that they can improve and make sure that they treat people correctly in the future. It's important for us lawyers to know when we're doing something wrong. And I know a lot of people are scared to report or complain about someone, but the only way they're going to get better or to learn or to avoid hurting someone in the future is if we tell this Colorado Supreme Court that something is going on that's wrong. Unfortunately, we've seen some people lose a lot of money and be taken advantage of, and I really don't like that at all. It's very frustrating. It makes the whole immigration process more complicated, because when we are working with clients in immigration law, we have to work as a team. We have to trust each other, because immigration is one of the biggest issues in our clients' lives, and we don't want to screw that up for them. So we want to make sure that clients are getting the right kind of advice and that they're not going to be harmed. So that's why I have that information on the slide. Okay, I think that's everything I have from the slides. So I'll stop sharing those and then I'll be able to answer some questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was a great presentation. I actually learned quite a few things today. We do have, yeah, we do have a question in the chat. We're waiting on the user to type it. Hopefully it'll come through here in the next minute or two. I don't see any questions on Facebook Live at the moment. I do have some questions just to keep the conversation going a little bit.
Great.
I wanted to ask you about DACA, deferred action for childhood arrival. So there is an advanced parole process where people can apply and go to the countries that they came from, or really potentially any country around the planet. They're just limited with the reasons why they would want to have that advanced parole.
Exactly.
Could you maybe talk a little bit more about, are there any sort of statutes or any case law that talk about what a humanitarian purpose means?
No, there isn't anything that clear. But really what we have seen, at least most recently, is that anything that we can justify or explain with evidence goes a long way. So we've had people recently who, you know, they may have a family member that's elderly, for example, that's not dying necessarily, but is sick and maybe needs some extra support at home. And the person with DACA has the flexibility to go home and be with them for 2 weeks while they need care. It can be that. It could be, you know, it generally turns on family in the humanitarian category, although we have had a client who traveled in order to get medical care for themselves in their home country because they felt like they had a better chance of success with their unique situation in their home country, getting the care that they needed.
And if someone has an emergency type situation, let's say a family member is passing away, they want to go to the burial, is there a fast way to process that?
So yes, there is an indicated method to do that. However, it is a frustrating system because it's very slow. So there is the USCIS or immigration. So I guess there's two ways to talk about it. One is, let's say you filed for your advanced parole thinking you had more time on your hands and the circumstances have changed. But you have like a receipt notice from the application. Then you could call, there's a 1-800 number on the bottom of that form for USCIS, and you would call that number and you would tell them you want an info pass. An info pass is an appointment at the closest USCIS office in order to see if you can get a stamp or a permit to travel sooner than the typical processing times. And when you contact USCIS requesting the info pass, you have to explain what makes it an emergency on the phone. And then that person on the phone could determine right then and there if it's an emergency or not. And just based on your responses, like they may say, okay, well, who is sick? How do you know them? What are they sick with? And you could say, well, you know, I have some letters from the doctor. My mom has been texting me. This is the situation. And then you would want to be able to bring all of that information to your InfoPass appointment. You can also get an InfoPass appointment by going to the uscis.gov website. There's a little box up in the right-hand corner that says Ask Emma. You can open that. It's like a live chat option. You do the same thing. You would type in InfoPass, you would explain what you need, and they would connect you with someone who can try to help you with that. The typical system, though, is you make the initial inquiry, you explain why you need the InfoPass, and then you have to wait for the government to call you back on your cell phone. You give them your cell phone, and they can call you back at any time. And they give you one chance. So if you see the weird number calling you on your phone, you have to answer it. Otherwise, you have to start all over again. So there is a process by which you can say, I need to expedite my pending application. You would do the same thing even if you didn't have a pending advanced parole. You would just try to explain to them you need an info pass for an emergency travel permit. But what we've been very frustrated by is that in a true emergency situation, the system is just not fast enough. That it could be 2 weeks before someone calls you back. If they decide it's not an emergency, it's a full 30 days before they call you back. And when they call you back, they then tell you when the appointments are available. So sometimes they could call you back in 30 days and say, oh, you're in Colorado? Well, that's the Denver field office. We don't have any appointments at the Denver field office. Well, that's not helpful.
Related to both DACA and temporary protected status, is there a risk to advanced parole? Let's say you get approval of you're an advanced parolee, and you're allowed to leave the country, whether it's for humanitarian, employment, educational purposes under DACA or under TPS. Really, you just, you wanted to, I don't know, leave the country for some reason.
Yeah.
But you wanted, advance notice, right? Permission to be able to come back. Is there a risk that people face?
Yes. I mean, there is always a risk. A grant of advanced parole, a travel permit, is never a guarantee that you will be allowed back into the US. That said, of course, we will sit down with clients and we'll talk about what the risks are for each of them. It will vary on your situation. The two most common risks that we think are worth talking about significantly are any criminal issues and prior deportations. Specifically with prior deportations, we are seeing case law all over the map about whether travel on advanced parole is the implementation of a prior unexecuted deportation. So even though we feel very strongly that it's not, I've had clients with different issues with this. It did not prevent them from coming back to the US. I do want to say that it didn't prevent them from coming back into the US, but it prevented them from being able to do the next thing they had planned to do. So with DACA too, the same thing. It's really, it's really criminal issues and prior immigration history problems.
Going off of that a little bit.
Yeah.
What about domestic relations issues, family law matters? Let's say you're married, you want to get a divorce, you went through a divorce, there's child support, it gets registered with the child support registry here in the state of Colorado. There's back owed child support someone hasn't been paying. Would that affect their advanced parole in any way if they owe child support, let's say?
That's a great question. I've never been asked that question. My initial response would be no, that yes, that will cause them problems in other ways, but it doesn't make them inadmissible to the United States, which is what I would be focused on, is that there is currently, at least, not a law that would say you cannot enter the US if you owe child support.
Okay.
They'd probably want you to come back so they could get the money.
And with temporary protected status right now, some countries, you mentioned a few countries where they're not renewing temporary protected status. I'm just going to throw out El Salvador for an example.
Yeah.
Can people still get advanced parole even if they haven't renewed their TPS?
Yeah. And so just to be clear, TPS is auto extended. So it is renewed. It's just you don't have a work permit with the dates on it. So what we have instead is just a printout basically of the Federal Register saying, see, it's been extended. It's also on the USCIS website. And yes, advanced parole is available to you in that situation as well.
Great. All right. And we're going to go, I just have one question based on asylum right now.
Okay.
This is from one of the chat boxes. And it essentially, it's asking if someone comes into the country with asylum with their children, and one of those, and let's say they came into the country, for example, with 2 children, but they have 3, and the third child is still in their home country. Is there any sort of legal avenue for them to be able to get asylum for that third child?
There could be. The lawyer answer, there could be. You know, I'm trying to think through my clients and what we have done in the past. And we've had some children that were kind of added later, but they were all in the United States at the time we added them.
Like when you apply for asylum, you're supposed to name your children as an adult, right?
Yeah.
I don't know anything about immigration law, so.
Right. Yeah, you know, I'm trying to think about if you could do the I-730 for someone who's outside of the US. And, you know, there's this form and it's basically following to join is what we call it in immigration law. So you may be able to use that for someone outside of the US. For children in particular, it's really important that they stay unmarried. Usually child in immigration law is defined as someone who's under 21 and unmarried. So that's one thing I would mention. But yeah, if you could call them to be a derivative on your asylum application, you have 2 years to add spouses and children. And I would do that through that I-730. You know, that you'd have to be able to prove they're your child too. That's the other, of course, thing. Yeah.
And I really don't want to get into like marriage and because that is based on state to state, state by state, and country by country, how they define marriage when people get married. But what if you have a child and that is not the child of your current spouse? Like, would that affect?
I mean, as long as they're your biological child, or even in some cases a stepchild, where the stepchild relationship was created before the child turned 18, under immigration law, that the definition of child includes those situations. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the child has been, you know, acknowledged by both parents, for example, even if they're not married.
Okay. And what I hear from you is the main focal point is you have about 2 years to apply from the time you apply for asylum or the time you're granted asylum?
From the time you're granted.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's true for people who say come in as a refugee. So just to differentiate, asylum are people that are in the US, on US soil, asking for protection to not go back. Refugees are people that are identified outside the US as needing protection, who are then brought into the US as a refugee. So usually that's through the UN process for refugees. And so you could have someone who's been designated a refugee who comes into the US and either has a, you know, someone, they had a spouse that couldn't come with them or a child that couldn't come with them. They could try to figure out how to bring them later. Well, within 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, those were the few questions I could come up with during your presentation.
Those are good ones.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have anything further you would like to mention?
I guess what I would say is, as much as I, you know, want to make sure people are safe, I don't want to send the message that everyone has to have an attorney to file an immigration form. You can certainly file it yourself. I just want people to be very careful about who they ask for help if they're choosing to do it by themselves. You know, you don't have to have an attorney to file a form. I just don't want people to get taken advantage of by other people who don't know what they're doing or have them file the wrong form, which we see all the time. And not recently, but in the not too distant past, there was a person here who claimed they, you know, worked for immigration and they knew what they were doing and they could get someone a work permit, and they would file these fraudulent asylum applications. And the problem with asylum is if you don't go to your asylum interview or you don't win your asylum case, you're automatically forwarded to immigration court. And so we'd see a lot of people who then went to immigration court and didn't know, and they never went to court. And so then they have a deportation order they don't know about.
Mhm.
So we've had to go back and untangle all of that at great expense, unfortunately. So, you know, that's why I just say I just want people to be careful.
At one point, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you mentioned to me that an asylum case takes about 100 hours from start to finish.
Yeah, probably.
On a conversation you and I had.
Yeah. They are exceptionally complicated. You know, because a lot of asylum cases. So I'm just going to back up and say, to be eligible for asylum, you have to be able to establish that you've had past persecution or have a reasonable fear of future persecution in your home country for a specific reason. And those reasons are race, religion, nationality, and political opinion. And then the last one is called a particular social group. So the first four are kind of obvious, you know, your race, your religion, your political opinion, those are pretty easy to identify things, but a particular social group could be as broad as Guatemalan women, or Guatemalan women treated as property, or it could be family members of so-and-so who's targeted for a specific reason. So when we're trying to write an asylum brief in that area, there's a lot of work that has to be done to basically explain the basis for harm, why the person is going to be harmed in their home country, and that the reason for that harm meets the requirements of the law. And that's in addition to all the regular asylum arguments we have to make about making sure the asylum application was filed within 1 year of entry to the US. And if it wasn't filed within 1 year of entry, why wasn't it filed? Is there an exceptional circumstance such as PTSD or other things, incapacity, that would prevent someone from filing their asylum application in a timely manner? So that, plus you have to get all the country conditions evidence. You have to prove all the conditions in the home country to support why your country isn't a safe place. So, you know, in El Salvador, it's a little bit easier to argue that nowhere in El Salvador is safe because it's a small country. But when you get to bigger countries, let's say Mexico, for example, it can be harder to prove, like, that a person can't go to any part of Mexico and be safe. Now, that may be very well true, but it just takes more work to prove. And even once you have, go ahead.
In some sense, you're building the case, but you're also telling a story within the parameters of what the law allows.
Yeah, exactly. And then even once you prepare all that and you file the brief and all the evidence, you still have to prepare everybody to testify. Because in asylum, credibility, or the judge's ability to trust what you're saying, your witness is saying, is everything. So you really have to make sure that they feel very comfortable with their story and can talk about it. And for a lot of people who are really traumatized, this takes a lot of time. This can be very difficult to relive and then feel comfortable talking about.
And let's say, going on to the conversation, what you mentioned about like notaries and paralegals and therapists, and just really any individual who's not an attorney helping fill out these forms and applying, you know, helping these people essentially tell their story without really having that legal background of saying, like, this is what you should be saying here, right? This is how you build the case. So I can see
it can be very tricky, because some of these people are very good intended. You know, they really want what's best. They want to help. And they can, right? Like, going to a therapist can certainly be helpful in an asylum case. We just don't want them filling out the asylum application. You know, so, you know, you hear it a lot. Well, it's just a bunch of forms. How hard is it to fill out forms? And it's like, oh, no. These forms are just loaded with pitfalls and places where it seems obvious, but it's not. And, what you include and what you don't include and why is something that you wouldn't know on just first reading the form.
And really an attorney is trained to be able to identify these words, right? To identify the issues and say, okay, this is what it's actually asking.
Yeah.
And if they don't know, they'll do some research on behalf of the individual and say, no, this is why you want to word it this way and not that way. Like at the end of the day, that could win or lose a case based on what's said.
Yep, absolutely. We've definitely had that issue come up. So yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for your time. We really appreciate this. This is a great presentation.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, thank you guys for all being here. Thank you for those that listen now and listen later. And I'm really glad this opportunity is available to people. There is just so much about immigration law that is complicated and not simple, but that doesn't mean we don't talk about it and do our best to kind of share as much information as we can to help people feel comfortable with it and make good choices.
Great. Well, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for watching. These videos will be recorded in Spanish and in English, and they will be available at the Garfield Library's Facebook page. Keep an eye out for that. If you have anybody who was wanting to attend and missed it, you can point them to the recording. Tony and Jennifer, would you like to maybe put something in the chat to where people can contact you if they have further questions?
Sure.
Definitely.
Sure. Oh, I don't think I typed. I think I had a typo. Oh, I did. Darn it.
We can try that again.
Okay, I'll try that again. Okay.
All right, and can you read that out loud for the recording?
Absolutely. So our website for Smith Immigration is www.glenwoodimmigration.com. And the email for our client manager at our office is assistant, ASSISTANT, @glenwoodimmigration.com.
Thank you.
And my contact information is tony@alpinelegalservices.org. You can reach our office at 970-945-8858. And our website is alpinelegalservices.org.
Thank you so much. Thank you again and have a wonderful night.
Thank you too.